Alright, we're back again with the Dirtywave MA, and today we are looking at creating our melodies and bass lines using the tracker workflow and how it cascades down to, one, just be able to make a melody, but some of the tricks I've learned over the years with trackers to get that sort of tracker essence to how we construct our melodies to work alongside chords, but also work together really nicely. So enough talking, let's get straight into it. Alright, we are back again with the Dirtywave MA, and today we are looking at making our melodies, bass lines, counter melodies and all that sort of stuff. Just because with the tracker workflow we are dealing with columns, so they can play a single note at each time, but we can use that to allude to chords and all that sort of stuff to create some really interesting textures, and that's why I like trackers. It does add a lot to how the sound comes out. But let's have a look at how to construct one first, and really I want to show a process that I use where it's not really music theory focused. You can start vibing and get an idea down inside, and then you can start applying theory on top to be able to bridge the gap. So in this one I'll show some techniques, but let's start by creating a first little chord. So I'm just going to start on 1, and then coming over here I'm just going to start on phrase 1, and then we have our first note. And I'm just going to make our first sound, because we do need the sounds. Like in the drum tutorial we just went in there and start programming the patterns, and then we assign the tracks, but it's really good to start with like a neutral sound that you like working with. And for me, I know I like my sort of chip tune, so I'm just going to create a little quick chip synth, and then we'll get back into it. Cool, so I created a bit of a neutral tone, so I'm using an ADSR because we'll talk about some of the melody stuff that we can do with specifically that one, and we just up a little table just to have that sort of sound working. But when you have a neutral tone, just make sure that it can handle, has quite a bit of range. So that could be a piano sound that you use, but it's just something that you're so used to, so you're more focusing on the melody than the actual sound design itself. So this is where I just start vibing with the device. Maybe I have an idea in my head, maybe I just want to play around with sound and see what comes out. But I think that's what is really handy about these types of handheld units, where they're always by your side. So if you got inspiration, you can capture it relatively quickly. But there's a few ways that we can do that, and I like just manually plotting things in. So we could start with a bit of a sequence. Maybe we can apply the notes and octaves going up and down and left and right. So you can plot something in, but if you're feeling it's not really working for me, that's where we can start looking at some of the generative stuff that we have available us to the Option and the arrow key. So what we can do is hold Shift and double tap Option. That's going to select the row, and then we can use up and down to change the pitch. So depending, up will change the pitches higher, down will change them lower. So if I do that, and then if you're really not vibing with it, you can change the entire pattern by pressing right, and that's going to create a whole new sequence that you can work with. And also you have the left, which is more like a Euclidean function where you can put in randomized elements like that. I did show most of this in the drum tutorial, but I think it's good to show those techniques before we start getting a little bit into the idea of melodies. So I've got a little sequence together, and I think it sounds okay. It's something I might pursue, but I think this is a really good point to start thinking about scales and chords that we're going to use for our music. And if you're not familiar, that's okay. The Mate does have some nice features on here that can help us sort of handhold our way through scales, and then we can construct chords, and everything's going to sound nice together, because right now it's set up in a chromatic scale. So if you double tap up holding Shift, you'll get into this scale editor view, and there's a lot of functionality in here, but we're just going to look at this as ways that we can just apply a basic sort of scale on top of it. So as you can see, we've got a C major scale. And if you want to apply that to how we enter notes, you can come back to the project setting over here, and you can see this line, you can apply it there. And playing in chromatic is good when you like have an idea of what the scales are and you know what the individual chords are. But if I put a sharp in here and I'm trying to put a C major up here, what we can do is we can sort of lock what notes are going to play. So we can just put any notes in, and then it will shift the tone around. So you could be like playing in a major scale. It's like, no, I want to try at a minor scale. It's going to adjust everything so you can sort of visually or sonically hear what's going on. So I've just put a sharp in there, and if we come up here and play, we can see how it's shifted that F sharp down, but we can also use that to make it only play in that scale as well, so we're not going to play any wrong notes. So it's just a nice way to handhold and be able to do that stuff. And you can get very complex up here. There's some nice offsets. We can detune it in different ways, and we can create really customized scales, which do have a lot, but I think this is a really good point to just highlight that we got something that can help us. Another thing this can help us out with is creating a bit of a musical mud map, and I've drawn one up a bit earlier for a different scale so you get an idea of what's going on, but we can use these notes to create this sort of visual map so we know what sort of notes align with chords, and then when we start creating a sort of overarching idea, we can align notes to those chords so we're always playing. And we'll show that throughout, but let's learn how to construct one of these things because it's just a bit of a grid. But I've got a nice little bit of paper here, and what you want to do is write down the first notes are all on here in a line across the bottom. So you got C, D, B, and that's going to keep repeating. But what you want to do is start constructing chords. So when it comes to the C major scale, you probably want the third and the fifth. So we're going to grab E and G. And then what you want to do is fill out those lines as well for doing each of the same. But you can sort of follow on from there. So we've got F, G, B, and then we cycle back around. So C and D. Same line again, we start at G, so we got A, and we keep going up as well, so we can do a fourth line up here that adds some extra territory. But another thing I like to do is just number down the bottom, so 1, 2, 3, and you can do that for any scale. Like if I hold B and then move across here, you can see how those different scores change, and then we can apply that in the same fashion, and that just gives us a visual guide how we can construct our notes. So let's have a look at what we've got and seeing if it aligns with that first chord. So as I can see, I've got some C's, I've got some E's, I've got the G. We do have some notes that fall outside, but they're not dominating that chord pattern. So I think that works out well, but what I might do is just come out here and we're going to create that 1, 4, 5, 1 in this column here. So what I might do is just copy that along, and then I'll clone that phrase so I can edit that one. And we can look at transposing, making sure these align, and then doing something else. So with this one, we got the 4, so we want to make this into F, so I can select everything and do something like that. Cool, so this second sequence I've aligned to that 4 note. So what I can do is come back out and say, I want to transpose this. So these go up by semitone, so they're not going to jump like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I can just put 5. It's probably about 7 that's going to align most of those notes, and we can inspect that by this little part over here. So we see that G, we'll grab 2, we'll put it down there, and we'll create a new pattern there, and then we will align that to the 1. So then we can take this down to C, and then we can say change some notes around, so it's probably going to lead into something. So what I might do is use that B, because there are some tricky things, like with a scale they'll always try and push towards certain notes. So sometimes when you have like your root tone or the major chord, you can go about halfway and the notes are always going to try and push in this direction. So an F leading into G sounds nice, so what I can do is use that B to lead into the C and like dropping down from that. But don't feel like that's going to stop you or following the rules specifically to try and get things, but you can just trial parts and see how it sounds. So I've put something together that aligns with what we were talking about here, but we can have a bit of a listen, and just a way that you can navigate around to see what the notes are hitting is you can hold the Option key pressing up and down, and it's going to go through that entire chain to look at the different phrases. So if I hit play, just keeping in front of that arrow, you can, so you get a sense of how it's all going to come together. It does sound very template-ish, and that's where we can start changing up, but because we've respected that sort of chord progression, we can start making changes that sound good to our ears and getting the most out of the pattern. So I think that's just a nice way to be able to construct a melody or any sort of one of these lines, because when you start stacking them up, they're going to add more character to the sound. Like when you start having an idea of the tracker workflow, you have these different tracks that align. So if you can try and align, like say when you have all those 4 notes hitting to different parts of the chords, you create this sort of experience where it's like broken chords and Hocketing and all that sort of stuff, but they all are respecting these sort of chords. So you get that flavor of the chord, but you don't have the polyphony. Lots of words, but you can bring back that polyphony through this sort of tracker flow. So that's what I wanted to show. So that is my process for constructing any sort of line. So whether that's a melody line, a bass line, maybe you've got an arpeggiator going off at the same time, maybe there's like a pedal tone going in the background, but they're all following this sort of process where it's referencing back to those chords. But how do you keep them in their nice, neat little spots? And that really comes down to understanding the note range. So I have created a melody that's probably sitting between octave 4 and octave 6. And if I was to construct my bass line, it'll probably sit between octave 2 and octave 3. And what you're doing is creating this sort of sandwich of different layers. So they're not interacting with each other specifically. Maybe you want that, so that can be an option. But you're just creating these distinct layers. So we've got like a full sonic palette on the pitch. And then we start adding instruments to create that sort of sound design and depth. And maybe we do some panning as well. So we're filling up the space inside of the sound, because there's a lot of different accesses that we can fill, but it does give us a strong melody line. But I think this is a really good point to just highlight understanding like a melody contour, and that's really the shape of what the melody that we constructed. And we'll just start with this little phrase here, and it's just understanding that notes have direction. So like I was saying before, how with a sort of scale, like notes will try and bend out towards the center. What you want to do is sort of construct a line. So I know like C to E, it's going down, and then we got that going down, and then it comes back up to that point at the start, and then it drops down to B4. So it's a bit of a jumpy one, but as you can see, it creates a shape that we can follow. So if I was to do a counter melody, that just really means it goes in a different direction towards this main melody. So it could be something like that in the background, or it's a supporting melody, so it's actually following the contour, so it can come up like this, or it could be something that's completely different, so the flow, or like say a pedal tone would be something like that. But when you construct these sort of different lines, it gives different elements for the person to listen to. So, and the other thing too is your spacing. Like you don't want to have every single channel looking like that. It does get very chaotic very quickly, but when you start, say, this is my main melody line, and then I can have like a supporting melody that's like this, and maybe this bass line is a pedal tone. You create the different space within the rhythm, and they all support each other. So things will line up to support a chord, and then vice versa. So it's just a bit of understanding to like visualize what you're working on. If you're not feeling comfortable understanding what you're listening to, or you're trying to debug or find out what the wrong issue with the sound is, you can sort of draw it out, and then you might be able to spot what's going on. So once you've like had that sort of vibe session, we've done some bit of theory. I think there's another thing to make sure that's happening, is really why I kept it with the drum tutorial, is making sure that your melody fits in line with the rhythm, because a melody out of sync doesn't sound that good when it's not following the rhythm, it's doing its own thing. You want them to sort of sync up, and what I've done is I've just gone through and cleaned up some of the notes. I've shifted things back on the beat, so I had a 4 on the floor, so I know these highlighted notes along here. I'm just making sure they respect it. You don't have to do it all the time, but just having a melody follow along. So if I go shift, it just sounds a lot nicer. But I think this is a good point that we can start using the tracker workflow to take like just raw melody and making a little bit more nicer. And I think what I'll do is I'll just come up to here and we can have a look at some of the effects that we can apply. But one thing I didn't show in the drum tutorial, which is really nice for our melody tutorial, is doing a backspace on an empty spot. So going Option, Edit, and it creates this off command. So how I was putting the kill command over here, which stops the note flat. This has a few different ways it can work depending on the type of envelope you use. So right now I've got it set up with the ADSR envelope. So this one, it will actually stop the sustain. So it will keep going at that note until it hits that off command, and then it will use the release to drop it out. The other way that you can do it is using the AD envelope, and when it hits that off command, it's going to kill the note flat. So just choosing that depending on your instrument, what you want it to do, but you can hear how it's respecting that. So what I can do is I can just place a few of these around. So maybe one there, and it just changes how that sequence happens because we're adding note length to everything. So what I can do, holding Option and going down, I can go to the next phrase. So I can do one there, maybe do one there and one there. Now, when it comes back to here, we've already done that because that's the first phrase, and then I can put some more in here. And if we listen to that all together in this view, cool. So it's just giving us that flavor. This is where we can start coming into here. So maybe if you want a note to pretty much drop off, there's no release, you can come up into instrument and add that kill. So adds that like sort of like at the end of it, it has a different flavor. So it's just a nice one to have. Maybe we want a sort of glide into a new note. So maybe we come up to here, we can come up and then I want that one, slide note. And then we can come down and start adding them around. So maybe I add. You want to be sparingly. You don't want to put them every note or everything because it's just going to change up the sound. So what else could we add? We could add some things like maybe we want to delay a note. So somewhere down here, we want to add like a dotted eighth and like push the note a little bit further along. So we can use that delay and then using the tick amount. So we did explain that in the drum video, but just coming up to here, you can see that our tick amount is 6. So say we want to push that along half a note or a half a step in between. So we can set that to 3. So we can do some like triplets and that sort of stuff with that. But there is a few other like really cool ones. Like maybe we want to add an arpeggiator up here. So what I can do is we'll do that and we can put one there. So you get that sort of like chip tune aesthetic. So you're putting in the semitones to create a chord. So you could do a minor or major, and just adds a bit of different flavor, and that has a lot of different applications. So we can expand on it using that one. So it just creates other tones as well. But yeah, it really comes down to taking the idea, and then there is a bunch in there so you can explore and experiment, and that will be followed up by a future video going through each one to explain exactly what they do. But just for constructing a melody, something else that we can do is maybe play with the velocity. Probably a little bit too aggressive, but it just accents these major notes that fall on the drum so they're not lost behind it, but that's probably getting a little bit too tweaky. So I think that's taking a very basic melody and just applying some effects. You can really start getting some stuff out of this, and I think this is a good point to leave that melody. We've done enough work with it now. We'll talk about changing up instruments later, but this is where I want to start talking about our bass line. And I think, so let's have a look at making our bass line. So I'm just going to create a new chain, and I'm just going to make a new phrase, and I'm going to come in here. And what we can do is just add a note here. So we're just going to start here because that's our root tone. And I think that's really important to understand because you can have bass lines that do jump around all the different notes. But when it comes to chords, the bass is usually the one that grounds the chord. So making sure that if you're playing like the first chord or a C major, you can start with that C. And you can bounce around, but 80% of the time it's really good to stay in that part, and then 20% of the time you can bounce around to these other notes, and it just makes sure that the song is staying grounded like that. So what I can do is I'll make that follow the rhythm of the drums as well. So we might do something like that, and then we can start adding some of our melody elements. So maybe I'll make that cut out there, and then we take that, and I'm just going to use that transpose to make it follow our note. So I'm going to go 1, 4, 4, 5, 1. This is in semitone, so which is F, and then G. So if I bring that all together, cool. So we got something that sounds like a very good chippy dippy tune. Maybe we bump that up to a G, so it's playing that root note. Cool, so it sounds like a bass line, it's following along. It's probably sound very basic because I'm probably picking the most basic things of a 1-4-5 progression with a C major scale, but you get the idea. You can experiment on this device and do a bunch of different things. Like if I wanted to make that sort of counter melody that we were talking about before, I can come over here and maybe we don't stick to the grid, maybe we add it down here so it's sort of like a call and response. So the melody talks and then this one talks, and we'll make it go into that higher scale. So maybe up here, and maybe it's just a little tiny flourish like that. And if we play that, so you can add those elements on top, and maybe I explore this a little bit more. Maybe it's something small, and so we can start adding more of it to this side. So we've got 2 extra channels that we can start playing. But when you start adding extra notes and you start trying to target a lot of the chord itself through those melodies, or bass lines or supporting melodies, all that sort of stuff, you start adding to those chords, and that's where you start getting that sort of tracker sound. So I really like that. I think this is a good point to stop playing with the melodies and we can start playing with some of the instruments, because when you start changing up, because I've made a chip tune, I'm not going to lie, we can start getting to those other territories. So this is where we start moving away from that chord tone, because that's very basic. Like it could be a piano, it could be what I've done here. But when we start moving into our instruments and start changing everything up, that's where we're going to start getting some interesting sort of sound and bringing it back to the sort of music we like making. So what I can do is just come over here and we can change up the whole song itself. So if you want to play it like that, or just play this one here. So I've been working on a bit of a sample pack, and we can change up the sound by that one, and that's going to apply it to all the instruments that. So it's just a quick way to change it up, but this is where we can start changing the notes inside of our pattern. So say with our bass line, that was very basic. So what I want to do is change that to number 2. Maybe I pick something that's a little bit more plucky. So what I've done is I've gone through each of the channels and just made one basic instrument for each one, so they're all separated out into their own parts. So if we listen to the bass line, which is a sample synth that I've picked out, and then we've got this one, which is just sort of like a high saw sound, but I've had some effects on top, and then that just gives us sort of like a sonic plate to start working with. But I think this is where trackers get good, is when we can start doing some hocketing. So that's really mean we have our melody line, we have our instrument, and then we can bounce around to different parts. So really what we're doing is just coming in there and changing out the tone. So you can do this in a variety of different ways, but it's just bringing in different instruments that work well together. So could bring something like that in, but we do have like a way that we can list things out. So what I usually have is like multiple instruments that sound similar but a little bit different, and then I can like leverage them in a track and bring things in and out. So if I was to just load just some different things, they might not work, but we'll see how it goes. But and let's say we come in here, we'll do the last one. And if we listen to this in context, so we'll just set up so it solos, and then we'll bring everything in. And this is where understanding what instruments you're using, because we are doing a bit of a tracker thing. So making sure the mix of the instruments is about the same level, so they're not punching through too hard, and they do work together. But this is how you get to this point. We're just creating these singular lines where are referring back to a really nice structure, and we can create our melody lines and bass lines that way. So I think that's a really good point to leave it there, but I think because in our drum tutorial we started getting off that grid territory, how can we leverage that here? And I'm just going to create some new points, so it's only playing those drums, and this is where I was having that discussion before with polyrhythms, and we're going to look at polymeters. But I do believe I messed up a little bit when I was talking about polyrhythms and polymeters, and the difference being that one sticks to the 4 on the floor, so like we did with the triplet, you have the 4 on the floor within a single bar, and then you have that triplet in sync with that. So that's one way of doing it. And the way that we did it here is a polymeter. So we create different ranging sequences, and then we just let them run, and they'll continually keep going, but they will never, there's certain points where they'll fall back on the grid, but they will just continually keep moving on. So just between those two, how can we leverage that for melody lines and that? And we are going to look at a proper polyrhythm, not a polymeter, and I'll do an update in the last one. So I've just set up this thing because this is probably going to be our rhythm, and we're going to look at some more of the generative stuff on the machine. But I think like as understanding polyrhythms, this is where we start creating those ratios. And I think like we do have access to like adding delays. We can change the groove to create our triplets and that sort of thing, but I can just press B and shift across because I've set up a basic part. But just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to set up that basic triplet pattern, so as I did before. And then we use the delay, so we come up here and then we set that to 2 and 4, so we'll do that, and we'll copy and paste all that so we can draw it out as well. So I'm going to copy that. So we got our triplet, and that works alongside everything else. But what I might do is I'm just going to copy this and paste it over here, because we need to have close access to these parts here, because I want to do some things where I change the melody based on a random seed. So what I can do is come up into here and choose randomize left, and that can change the note depending on that note there. So we can use that to place a few of those around. So we've got that changing the melody, but if we have a look as well and hold A on here, we can see that we're adjusting the instrument as well. So if you have like that bank of different sounds, you can change the note as well as the instrument as it plays through. So what we can do, because I've picked the instrument that has a non-instrument in the next slot, we can use that second value to be like oh, it's going to play so many notes, but be randomized in that way. So if I set that to 1, as you can hear, it's playing notes in and out, and that's going to be random throughout the song. So if you want to cement these sort of melodies in, you got to write them in, but you can use generative stuff to like break it up. And there are other ways too, like you can put like a chance command in here, and depending on how it works, because it does change the value to the left and to the right, if you have it set up like this, it will actually skip that first note. So you can use that as a different way to adjust things. But just with that, we'll come back out here. So we've created a bit of randomization with the notes, but there are some things that you got to keep in mind, like if I wanted to use the chance function, so that lives here, like it will work for this one because we have the left and the right value, and then having it on a instrument or the note range like that, that chance will activate and say this will play if it meets the right ratio. But if you put that chance function, so we'll just remove that, if you put that chance function between here, the first value will adjust this randomize, and then the right value will adjust our delay. So it doesn't work like that. Because of that, we can do another way of setting up like our chance for that note to trigger, and that's coming into the table itself. Now we got to do a little bit of a program, so I'm just going to set up a kill command, so you can find that one there, and then we set up that chance command. So this sort of works in a way, kind of feels inversed, but this chance value is telling me it has a 0% chance of working, so it will not activate. But as we go up, when it starts reaching 100% of the chance, it will kill the command. So we can put it somewhere in between. So we have our sound. Cool, so what I've done is I've just applied some of those random commands. It's still running with that same instrument. we can listen to everything as it goes through, and we can make changes to that instrument. So say and that's just some nice ways to add generative functionality to your melodies. So in the end, I hope this is giving you some food for thought, because taking music theory and applying it to the tracker workflow, it can be a little bit daunting, but being able to break it up per channel and explore, not just plot in notes, but actually explore creating melodies on this thing. You probably noticed I had to do a few jump cuts because I was tinkering around a little bit too much, but you can get some really nice things out of this, and especially with this type of handheld tracker workflow, especially with the M8. You're going to get a lot out of it. So I hope this one has given you that idea, and if you did like it, definitely give that thumbs up, because it does tell the algorithm to point at other people that pro got the M8 and are really just starting out trying to get the most out of the machine. And with that as well, if you have any comments or queries about how to construct melody lines or bass lines and doing all that sort of stuff, please feel free to leave them down below. I do go down there and try and answer as many questions as I can to really support this device. And this one is on an ongoing series, so if you haven't watched how I did those drums before, you can find that in my previous video. But we'll be following on with like chords and texture. We'll be looking at some of the sound design stuff on here. We'll be looking at those synths and synth engines specifically, because they got a lot to offer on this thing. And yeah, so if you're looking for that type of content, I hope to see you next time.